If a single choice could change the fate of a kingdom, what would you do? The question seemed to drift through the crisp autumn air long before Princess Evelyn Ashford heard the auction master's booming voice echo across the crowded square. The Royal Exchange stood at the center of Havencrest, stretching nearly half the length of a football field beneath rows of white stone arches draped with blue and silver banners. Merchants shouted over one another, horses stamped against the cobblestones, and polished carriages lined the streets while nobles watched from shaded balconies above. Yet beneath the polished elegance lingered something colder, something Evelyn had never been able to ignore. Every pair of iron chains, every lowered gaze, every person waiting to be judged by strangers. She stepped down from the royal carriage, her ivory cloak catching the morning breeze as dozens of heads turned toward her. Some bowed with practiced grace. Others simply stared, eager for entertainment. Tradition demanded that the king's only daughter attend the autumn selection once every 7 years. Tradition demanded she choose one servant from those presented before the crown. Tradition, her father often reminded her, existed because emotions could not govern kingdoms. Evelyn had smiled politely when he said it. She had never believed him. A silver bell rang once above the platform. Then again. Silence slowly swallowed the marketplace until even restless children clung to their parents without speaking. The auction master climbed onto the wooden stage, dressed in an immaculate burgundy coat trimmed with gold embroidery. His polished boots reflected the morning sun as though no dust dared touch them. He stretched both arms wide with theatrical confidence before lowering his head toward the princess. "Your Highness," he declared, his voice carrying effortlessly through the square. "According to royal custom, today's first privilege belongs to you. You may choose one slave before bidding begins." Hundreds of eyes shifted from the stage to Evelyn. Some expected excitement. Others expected indifference. Several wealthy lords exchanged knowing smiles, already assuming she would select one of the strongest laborers or perhaps an educated servant suited for palace duties. Evelyn remained perfectly still. Her pale blue eyes wandered beyond the polished stage, past the rows of merchants and guards, settling instead on the long line of weary faces standing quietly behind the iron railing. Young, old, men, women. Each wore a numbered tag around their neck instead of a name. She noticed trembling hands folded together. Someone quietly comforting an elderly stranger beside him. Another lifting a frightened child just enough for the little girl to see the sky beyond the crowd. None of those small acts appeared in the official records her tutors loved so much. Those records listed only age, trade, health, and price. Never kindness. Never courage. Never hope. The auction master cleared his throat, assuming she had simply not heard him. "Princess Evelyn," he repeated with an amused smile. "Please honor the kingdom with your selection." She slowly turned toward him. For a heartbeat, the entire square seemed to stop breathing. Evelyn looked at the rows of waiting faces once more before quietly shaking her head. "No," she said. The single word drifted across the silent marketplace like a falling feather. Confusion spread faster than whispers. The auction master blinked. Several nobles frowned. Even the royal guards exchanged uncertain glances. No princess had ever refused the opening selection. No daughter of the crown had ever interrupted a tradition older than the kingdom itself. The auction master's smile stiffened as he forced out a polite laugh. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "perhaps you misunderstood the custom." Evelyn's calm gaze never left the people standing behind the railing. "No," she answered again, softer this time. "I understood it perfectly." The silence lingered so long that even the pigeons circling above the cathedral roof seemed reluctant to land. Princess Evelyn Ashford did not lower her eyes, nor did she rush to explain herself. She had spent her entire life inside marble halls where every answer was expected before every question had been fully asked. Today felt different. Today she allowed the silence to speak first. Somewhere behind her, the captain of the royal guard shifted uneasily. He knew the court would not welcome uncertainty, especially not in front of nearly 1,000 spectators gathered from every province of the kingdom. The auction master carefully adjusted the gold cuffs around his sleeves, forcing confidence back into his smile. "Your Highness," he said with measured patience, "this ceremony has remained unchanged for more than 300 years. Every heir to the throne has honored this tradition." Evelyn slowly turned toward the raised platform, her expression composed but distant, as though she were listening to a memory instead of the man standing before her. 300 years. She had heard those words countless times growing up inside Ashford Palace. 300 years of customs. 300 years of laws. 300 years of people insisting that history alone made something right. Her earliest tutor had once pointed toward a beautifully painted family tree hanging in the Great Hall. "Every ruler before your father followed tradition, Princess. One day you will too." She had only been 9 years old when she quietly asked a question no one had answered. If every generation simply repeats the last one, who is brave enough to make tomorrow different? The old tutor had smiled politely before changing the subject. Her father had not smiled at all. King Edward Ashford believed stability was the highest form of mercy. A predictable kingdom was a peaceful kingdom. Every ceremony reinforced order. Every ritual reminded the people where they belong. Evelyn understood his reasoning, and she loved him deeply, but there were moments when she wondered whether order had become more valuable than compassion. The memory drifted through her mind as she looked once again toward the waiting line beyond the iron railing. None of them spoke. Some avoided eye contact completely. Others stared at the ground with quiet acceptance, as though expecting nothing except another day decided by strangers. Then something unexpected caught her attention. Near the far end of the line, partially hidden behind taller figures, a little boy no older than 7 struggled to keep a folded blanket from slipping onto the dusty stones. Before the fabric touched the ground, one of the prisoners beside him reached over with restrained hands and gently lifted the corner back onto the child's shoulder. It was such a small gesture that almost no one noticed. The guards certainly did not. The nobles were too busy whispering among themselves. Yet Evelyn watched the boy smile for the first time since arriving at the square. Whoever the man was, he never looked toward the princess afterward. He simply stepped back into place without asking for recognition. Kindness offered without expectation. Her heartbeat slowed. She remembered her late mother telling her during quiet evenings beside the palace fireplace, "You will learn more about a person's heart in one unnoticed moment than in 100 carefully chosen speeches." Queen Catherine had passed away 5 winters earlier, but her voice still found Evelyn when she needed it most. The auction master finally broke the silence again, this time with less confidence than before. "If your highness would prefer," he offered, "we can begin with the strongest candidates. Many possess useful skills for palace service." Evelyn gently folded her hands before her gaze never leaving the distant end of the line where the unknown prisoner now stood motionless once again. Something inside her whispered that the kingdom was about to witness far more than another ceremony. It was about to reveal the difference between seeing people and merely looking at them. The auction master hesitated just long enough for uncertainty to spread through the square like a breeze before a storm. He had spent nearly 30 years commanding attention from kings, merchants, and noble families alike, and never once had a ceremony slipped beyond his control. Yet the young woman standing before him refused to follow the invisible script everyone else seemed determined to protect. He forced another polished smile across his face and spread both hands toward the waiting line. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "Your Highness would prefer to examine the selections before making your final decision." Without waiting for an answer, he motioned for the attendants to begin. One by one, the prisoners were guided onto the raised platform. The first was introduced as a skilled blacksmith capable of forging horseshoes and farming tools. The next had once worked as a stone mason whose buildings still stood in distant villages. Another had studied medicine before war and famine had destroyed his home. Each introduction ended the same way. A list of abilities. A number. A price. The crowd listened politely, but their attention drifted whenever someone lacked impressive credentials. Wealthy buyers whispered calculations behind embroidered fans while merchants nodded approvingly at strong shoulders and steady hands. To them, Every life could be measured by usefulness. Evelyn listened without interrupting, but something unsettled her more with every passing moment. Nobody mentioned birthdays. Nobody spoke of families left behind. Nobody wondered what dreams had existed before these people became inventory. She watched a middle-aged woman quietly smooth the wrinkles from the sleeve of an elderly stranger standing beside her, even though her own clothing was faded and worn. A young man gently steadied another whose knees trembled after standing for hours beneath the morning sun. These simple moments disappeared beneath the auction master's rehearsed speeches, unnoticed by almost everyone except the princess. Lord Gregory Hawthorne, one of the wealthiest nobles in the capital, leaned toward another aristocrat with an amused smile. "She is overthinking this," he murmured just loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Choose the strongest worker and return to the palace." That is how every royal before her handled the ceremony. Several nodded in agreement. Tradition felt comfortable. Predictable. Safe. Evelyn slowly stepped away from the royal carriage and began walking along the length of the iron railing instead of remaining beside the stage. Her guards exchanged uncertain looks before following several feet behind, careful not to interfere. The prisoners lowered their eyes as she passed. Some appeared nervous. Others looked almost resigned, as though refusing to hope would hurt less than disappointment. She noticed rough hands marked by years of honest labor. She noticed tired faces that still tried to comfort frightened children standing nearby. She noticed people who thanked attendants for cups of water even when those attendants barely acknowledged them. Every quiet gesture challenged everything the official introductions had ignored. Then, near the very end of the line, she slowed. Standing slightly apart from the others was a man whose clothes were more worn than anyone else's. His wrists remained loosely bound, yet his posture carried an unmistakable dignity. He neither pleaded for attention nor attempted to avoid it. His dark brown hair brushed his shoulders, partially hiding a calm expression that seemed strangely untouched by the restless energy surrounding him. Most striking of all were his eyes. They did not carry anger. They did not carry fear. Instead, they held the quiet patience of someone accustomed to waiting for the truth to reveal itself. When a frightened little girl standing beside him stumbled after losing her balance, he instinctively shifted just enough for her to steady herself against his shoulder before gently stepping back again. No words. No performance. Just quiet kindness offered without expecting anyone to notice. Evelyn stopped walking. The noise of the marketplace faded into the distance until all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. Something inside her whispered that the man standing before her did not belong inside a line defined by prices, and for reasons she could not explain, she could not bring herself to look away. The moment stretched until even the auction master began to wonder whether he should call for the next presentation. Princess Evelyn stood motionless, her attention resting entirely on the quiet stranger near the end of the line. Unlike the others who occasionally glanced toward potential buyers with cautious hope, he seemed completely detached from the restless anticipation filling the square. It was not resignation she saw. It was discipline. The kind that could not be taught in a marketplace. One of the attendants noticed where the princess was looking and hurried toward the platform with visible concern. He whispered something into the auction master's ear. The older man frowned almost immediately before forcing another diplomatic smile. "Ah," he announced, clearing his throat. "I see your highness has noticed the final candidate." His voice carried an unmistakable note of hesitation that had been absent all morning. "There is very little to discuss regarding this one." Curious murmurs rolled through the crowd. Several merchants leaned forward while noble families exchanged puzzled glances. The auction master reluctantly opened a worn leather ledger, slowly turning several pages before stopping near the back. "Number 47, he read aloud. "Name: Damien." He paused again, as though expecting additional information to appear on the page. None did. No confirmed family records. No verified place of birth. No documented trade. No known property. Arrived with a northern transport convoy 6 weeks ago. He lowered the book slightly. He has spoken very little since his arrival. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the audience. Lord Gregory folded his arms with open amusement. An expensive mystery is still a poor investment, he remarked. Surely the princess has better judgment than that. Several buyers nodded in agreement. Others barely looked at Damien before returning their attention to the healthier candidates waiting nearby. One merchant even waved dismissively toward the platform. "Skip him," he called. "Show us someone useful." The auction master appeared grateful for the suggestion. "Quite right," he replied. "Number 47 has attracted almost no interest. We can continue." Yet before anyone could move Damien aside, an elderly attendant carrying a wooden crate stumbled as one of the uneven stones shifted beneath his foot. Apples spilled across the marketplace, rolling between booths and wagon wheels. The old man bent down with obvious difficulty, his hands shaking as he tried to gather them before they disappeared beneath the crowd. Several nearby buyers stepped around the scattered fruit without slowing. One complained that the delay was wasting valuable time. Another laughed softly as an apple rolled into the gutter. Damien did not hesitate. Though his wrists remained loosely restrained, he calmly knelt, gathering each apple within reach before carefully placing them back into the crate. When one rolled farther away, the little girl Evelyn had noticed earlier chased after it with tiny hurried steps. Damien gently reached it first, dusted it off with his sleeve, and handed it back to her with a warm smile that lasted only a heartbeat before he quietly returned to his place in line. He never looked toward the princess afterward. He acted as though kindness required no audience. Evelyn felt something shift inside her. Every polished introduction she had heard that morning suddenly seemed empty beside one simple act performed without expectation of reward. Queen Catherine had often said that true character revealed itself when no applause was waiting. Watching Damien stand once more with quiet composure, Evelyn finally understood exactly what her mother had meant. The auction master closed his ledger with a sharp snap, eager to move forward. "As I was saying," he declared, "there is nothing remarkable about this man." Evelyn continued looking at Damien, her calm expression unchanged, but for the first time since arriving at the Royal Exchange, certainty settled quietly into her heart. The crowd saw an ordinary prisoner. She was beginning to see someone the kingdom had somehow failed to recognize. The whispers that had drifted lazily through the marketplace only moments earlier began to grow louder, weaving together into a chorus of quiet opinions. Princess Evelyn could feel them following every step she took as she moved closer to the far end of the line. Noblewomen watched from shaded balconies with puzzled expressions hidden behind lace fans. Wealthy merchants folded their arms with growing impatience. Even the palace guards seemed unsure whether they should remain beside their princess, or gently persuade her to return toward the center of the ceremony. None of them understood why she had ignored every celebrated craftsman, every decorated worker, every carefully presented candidate. Lord Gregory Hawthorne finally stepped forward, offering a respectful bow that barely concealed his confidence. "Your Highness," he said with practiced courtesy, "if I may offer some advice, the crown should always invest in proven value. The kingdom needs capable hands, not unanswered questions." Several nobles nodded immediately. Another added, "The royal household already has enough servants. Choose someone who strengthens the palace. That is what this tradition exists for." Evelyn listened without interrupting. She had spent years attending council meetings where polished speeches often sounded wiser than they truly were. Her father always reminded her to hear every opinion before making a decision. So she listened. Yet, while their voices filled the air, her attention remained quietly fixed on Damien. He neither reacted to the criticism nor attempted to defend himself. Instead, he noticed the elderly attendant still struggling to lift the wooden crate onto a nearby wagon. Without waiting for permission, Damien stepped forward just enough to steady the crate while the old man caught his breath. Once the load rested safely in place, he immediately returned to his original position, saying nothing. The attendant looked surprised. "Thank you," the old man whispered almost instinctively. Damien simply inclined his head with a gentle smile before lowering his eyes again. The exchange lasted only seconds. Most people never noticed it. Evelyn did. Something about his silence felt unusual. It was not the silence of fear. Nor was it bitterness. It reminded her of the quiet confidence she had once seen in her mother while visiting the Royal Hospital years ago. Queen Catherine had spoken very little that afternoon, choosing instead to comfort frightened children with warm smiles and patient hands. Later she had told Evelyn, kindness never needs permission to exist. It simply chooses to. That memory returned with unexpected clarity now. Damien had been offered no reward. No applause followed his actions. In fact, most people barely acknowledged he had moved at all. Yet he continued noticing those everyone else overlooked. Evelyn slowly looked down at the weathered leather ledger resting beneath the auction master's arm. Numbers. Ages. Estimated value. None of those pages had prepared anyone to recognize compassion. The realization settled gently inside her heart. Perhaps that was why so many people had failed to understand the man standing quietly before them. They were searching for usefulness while ignoring character. The auction master sensed the direction of her thoughts, and quickly attempted to regain control. "Your Highness," he said, forcing another reassuring smile, "appearances can be deceiving. Sometimes quiet people simply lack ambition." Evelyn finally turned toward him. "Or perhaps," she replied softly, "they have learned that not everything worth doing needs to be announced." The answer caught him completely off guard. Around the square, conversations gradually faded. Even Lord Gregory lowered his voice. No one had expected the princess to challenge the assumptions surrounding the ceremony so calmly. Evelyn looked back toward Damien once more. For the first time, their eyes met. Only for a brief moment. Yet, in that single silent glance she saw neither gratitude nor expectation. She saw respect. As though he recognized that she had looked beyond the chains, beyond the ledger, beyond every label placed upon him. And for reasons she could not explain, that simple look made her more certain than ever that the greatest mistake in the marketplace was not the man everyone had ignored. It was that almost no one had truly seen him at all. The morning sun climbed higher above Havencrest, washing the white stone buildings in warm light, yet the atmosphere inside the Royal Exchange grew noticeably colder. Princess Evelyn remained standing before the final row while the murmurs surrounding her transformed into open conversation. The nobles no longer bothered lowering their voices. "She cannot possibly be considering him," one woman whispered behind a jeweled fan. "He has no family name." Another gentleman adjusted the silver chain across his waistcoat and laughed quietly. "Perhaps compassion has clouded her judgment." Lord Gregory Hawthorne stepped forward once again, this time speaking loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "Your Highness, forgiveness is admirable. Charity has its place. But a future queen must also think practically. The kingdom is built upon wise decisions, not sentimental impulses." Several council members nodded. The words sounded reasonable. They always did when spoken with polished confidence. Evelyn met his gaze without irritation. "Tell me, Lord Gregory," she asked gently, "what makes a decision wise?" The nobleman smiled as though the answer were obvious. "Value. Experience. Productivity. Those who strengthen the crown deserve opportunity." Evelyn glanced back toward Damien before looking at the long line once more. "And how do we measure value?" Lord Gregory blinked. "By what a person contributes." She remained silent for several seconds. The question lingered between them longer than anyone expected. Finally she spoke again. "If contribution is the measure, why have I witnessed more kindness from those standing behind this railing than from many standing outside it?" A wave of uneasy silence spread through the crowd. No one answered immediately. Several nobles exchanged uncomfortable looks before pretending to study the platform instead. The auction master sensed the conversation slipping further from his control and quickly clapped his hands together. "Perhaps we should continue the presentation," he announced with forced enthusiasm. "Number 12 is an accomplished carpenter. Number 18 has years of experience managing estates." Attendants hurried to guide more candidates onto the stage, describing each person's qualifications with rehearsed precision. Yet Evelyn noticed something the announcements failed to mention. As each individual stepped forward, Damien quietly encouraged them with a reassuring nod. When one elderly man became visibly nervous beneath hundreds of staring eyes, Damien offered a small smile that steadied him enough to continue walking. He never attempted to place himself at the center. He quietly helped others do so instead. The little girl standing nearby tugged gently on Damien's sleeve before pointing toward a loose ribbon slipping from her faded braid. With careful movements limited by the restraints around his wrists, Damien tucked the ribbon neatly back into place. The child beamed before hurrying back beside the older woman caring for her. Again, almost nobody noticed. Almost nobody except Evelyn. Queen Catherine had once told her that true leadership could often be found in those with no authority at all. Watching Damien comfort strangers without seeking recognition, Evelyn suddenly remembered another lesson her mother had shared while planting roses in the palace gardens. Titles reveal responsibility. Character reveals identity. For years Evelyn had admired those words without fully understanding them. Now they settled into her heart with remarkable clarity. The auction master finally approached her directly, lowering his voice so only those nearest could hear. "Your Highness," he said carefully, "there is still time to preserve the dignity of today's ceremony. The kingdom expects certainty from its royal family." Evelyn smiled politely. "Perhaps certainty begins by recognizing what everyone else has overlooked." Before the auction master could respond, a clear trumpet sounded from the palace balcony overlooking the square. It was the signal that the opening selection could not be delayed any longer. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned back toward the princess. The attendants stepped aside. The pathway leading to the final row stood completely open. Evelyn drew one slow breath, then began walking toward Damien with calm, unhurried steps, while across the crowded marketplace an uneasy feeling settled over every person who had been certain they already knew how this ceremony would end. Princess Evelyn's footsteps echoed softly across the worn cobblestones, each one measured, each one impossibly calm. No one spoke as she left the center of the royal exchange behind. The auction master stood frozen beside the platform, his confident smile fading into visible uncertainty. Even the musicians stationed near the royal balcony lowered their instruments without being instructed. The ceremony had reached the moment every noble family anticipated, yet nothing was unfolding according to tradition. The farther Evelyn walked, the quieter the marketplace became. She passed skilled craftsmen whose names had been praised all morning. She walked beyond experienced builders, respected healers, and accomplished servants whose qualifications filled pages of official records. Some lowered their heads respectfully as she passed. Others watched her with puzzled expressions, unable to understand why the princess never paused before them. Lord Gregory cleared his throat loudly enough to break the silence. "Your Highness," he called after her, struggling to keep concern from sounding like criticism. "The finest candidates are behind you." Evelyn did not stop walking. "Perhaps," she answered gently without turning around. "The finest person is not." Her words floated through the square, leaving another wave of uneasy silence behind them. The little girl standing near Damien looked up with wide blue eyes as the princess approached the final row. She instinctively stepped behind the elderly woman beside her, peeking around the edge of the faded shawl with shy curiosity. Damien quietly shifted his position, not to shield himself, but to make certain the child felt safe with so many unfamiliar faces watching. It was another small gesture. Another quiet choice that required no recognition. Evelyn noticed it immediately. When only a few feet separated them, she stopped. For the first time since arriving that morning, she stood directly before Damien. Neither of them spoke. The bustling city beyond the square seemed to disappear until only the distant flutter of banners could be heard above them. Damien slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. They were an unusual shade, somewhere between deep gray and winter blue, calm enough to resemble a quiet lake before sunrise. There was no pleading inside them. No resentment. No attempt to influence her decision. Instead, she found something she had rarely encountered, even inside the royal court. Peace. It was the expression of someone who refused to let circumstances decide the kind of person he would become. Evelyn remembered another lesson from her mother. During one summer afternoon, while watching gardeners restore a neglected courtyard, Queen Catherine had smiled and said, "Anyone can remain kind when life is easy. Pay attention to the people who choose kindness after disappointment. They are the ones who carry real strength." Standing before Damien now, those words felt less like a memory and more like an answer she had been searching for her entire life. The auction master hurried across the platform, beads of perspiration beginning to gather along his forehead despite the cool breeze. "Your Highness," he said cautiously, "there is no need to inspect this candidate personally. His records are incomplete. We know almost nothing about him." Evelyn finally turned toward the older man. "Then perhaps," she replied softly, "today is the first opportunity someone has taken the time to learn." Several members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others exchanged uncertain glances. The certainty that had filled the marketplace since sunrise was slowly unraveling. Damien remained silent throughout the exchange. His posture never changed. He neither defended himself nor accepted the assumptions spoken around him. It was as though he had long ago made peace with being misunderstood. That quiet confidence settled something inside Evelyn's heart. She no longer felt uncertain. She no longer searched for reasons. She simply knew. The trumpet sounded once more from the palace balcony, sharper than before, signaling that the royal selection could not be delayed another moment. Every face turned toward the princess. Every breath seemed suspended in anticipation. Evelyn looked at Damien one final time, and as a faint smile touched the corners of her lips, the entire kingdom unknowingly stood on the edge of a decision that would soon change far more than a single life. The final trumpet note faded into the autumn sky, leaving a silence so complete that the fluttering banners above the square seemed unusually loud. Princess Evelyn stood only a few feet from Damien, her hands folded calmly before her. The auction master glanced anxiously toward the royal balcony where members of the king's council watched from carved stone seats. Every second of hesitation made the ceremony more uncomfortable. Clearing his throat once again, he stepped carefully between the princess and the waiting line, offering a courteous bow that could not hide the worry in his eyes. "Your Highness," he said with measured respect, "before the royal selection is officially recorded, protocol allows me to ask one final time. Are you absolutely certain you wish to continue?" Evelyn looked at him quietly. "Continue with what?" she asked. The older man hesitated. "With this choice." He lowered his voice. "There are many excellent candidates whose records have been verified. This man has no confirmed history, no known family, no proven occupation. If your Highness wishes, we can begin the presentation again from the first row." Several nobles nodded eagerly. Lord Gregory even stepped forward another pace. "That would be the wiser course," he added. "No one would question a thoughtful reconsideration." Evelyn slowly turned, allowing her eyes to travel across the hundreds of faces gathered throughout the royal exchange. She saw merchants waiting patiently beside their wagons, mothers holding curious children close, palace guards standing perfectly still beneath polished armor, elderly citizens leaning on carved walking sticks. Every one of them expected the same ending they had witnessed for generations. They believed today would simply repeat yesterday. Her gaze returned to Damien. He remained exactly where he had been, neither hopeful nor discouraged. He had not spoken a single word asking to be chosen. He had not attempted to impress anyone. He simply stood with the same quiet dignity that had first captured her attention. The little girl beside him gently reached for his hand before remembering the restraints around his wrists. Instead, she smiled shyly up at him. Damien answered with a kind smile of his own. It lasted only a moment before he lowered his eyes once more, making certain the attention remained on the child rather than himself. Evelyn felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. The answer she had been searching for all morning suddenly seemed remarkably simple. Queen Catherine had once told her that wisdom often sounded quiet because it did not need to compete with louder voices. Standing in the middle of the crowded square, Evelyn finally understood exactly what her mother meant. She stepped forward until she stood directly beside Damien. The auction master instinctively opened the royal ledger, lifting his pen above the page. "Please state your selection for the official record," he announced. Every breath seemed to stop at once. Evelyn's voice remained gentle, yet it carried clearly across the entire marketplace. "I choose the last man in the line." No one moved. The words seemed almost too ordinary to create such extraordinary silence. Then the meaning reached the crowd all at once. Gasps spread from one side of the square to the other. A merchant accidentally dropped his hat. 2 council members stared at one another in disbelief. Lord Gregory's confident expression disappeared entirely. Even the palace guards exchanged uncertain glances before quickly looking forward again. The auction master's hand froze above the page. Ink trembled at the tip of his pen without touching the paper. He blinked once. Then twice. "Your Highness," he whispered, unable to hide his astonishment. "Are you confirming number 47 as your royal selection?" Evelyn met his eyes with quiet certainty. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Please write his name." The auction master slowly lowered his gaze toward the nearly empty space waiting inside the royal ledger. His hand hesitated as though the ink itself resisted what he had been asked to record, while across the silent marketplace every person present realized they had just witnessed the first decision in generations that no tradition had been able to predict. The first sound to break the silence was not a voice but the soft scratch of the auction master's pen finally touching the royal ledger. The ink spread slowly across the parchment as though history itself hesitated to accept what had just happened. Number 47. Damien. The letters looked surprisingly ordinary for a decision that had left an entire marketplace speechless. Then the whispers began. They started near the merchant stalls before spreading through the square in restless waves. Some spoke with confusion. Others with disbelief. A few with quiet admiration. Every conversation seemed to ask the same question. Why him? Lord Gregory Hawthorne was the first to step forward openly. His polished shoes echoed sharply against the stone as he approached the princess, careful to remain respectful despite the concern written across his face. "Your Highness," he said with measured restraint, "please allow me to speak not as a nobleman, but as a loyal servant of the crown. This decision will be discussed in every province before sunset. People may misunderstand your intentions." Evelyn listened calmly. "Perhaps," she replied, "they should spend less time guessing intentions and more time observing actions." Lord Gregory sighed softly. "The kingdom expects certainty from its future queen." Evelyn smiled with quiet warmth. "Then let them be certain that I will never judge a person's worth by the first page of a ledger." Around them, members of the King's Council exchanged uneasy glances. One elderly advisor quietly whispered to another while studying Damien from head to toe, clearly searching for some hidden explanation that would make the princess's decision appear logical. None could find one. The auction master finally closed the heavy book with both hands before signaling to the attendants. "Release the royal selection from the presentation line," he instructed. His voice remained steady, although his expression suggested he was still struggling to understand the moment unfolding before him. An attendant carefully stepped toward Damien, unlocking the simple restraints from his wrists with a small brass key. The quiet click echoed more loudly than anyone expected. Damien slowly lowered his hands, gently rubbing one wrist before offering a sincere nod of gratitude to the attendant instead of immediately turning toward the princess. The gesture surprised the older man, who blinked before awkwardly returning the nod. Once again, Damien thanked someone most people rarely noticed. Evelyn observed every detail. She noticed that he did not rush forward now that he had been chosen. He did not celebrate. He did not look around to see who was watching. Instead, he bent down beside the little girl who had remained close to him throughout the morning. From the pocket of his worn coat, he carefully removed a tiny wooden bird carved from a single piece of maple. It was simple, unfinished, and no larger than the palm of his hand. He placed it gently into the child's hands with a warm smile. The girl's eyes widened with delight. For me? She whispered. Damien nodded once. So you always remember to keep looking toward the sky, he answered softly. His voice was calm and steady, carrying the quiet confidence Evelyn had imagined all morning. The little girl hugged the small carving to her chest as though it were the greatest treasure she had ever received. Her grandmother wiped away a grateful tear before quietly mouthing the words "thank you." Damien simply smiled again and stepped back. He had walked away from the only possession he seemed to own without the slightest hesitation. Evelyn felt her certainty deepen. A man who willingly gave away his last keepsake to comfort a frightened child was not empty, no matter what any ledger claimed. High above the square, hidden behind the carved stone railing of the royal balcony, another pair of eyes had been watching every moment in complete silence. A tall figure dressed in a dark ceremonial cloak rested one hand upon the marble balustrade, his expression unreadable as his gaze followed Damien with unmistakable interest. He did not speak. He did not reveal himself. Yet, as the autumn breeze lifted the edge of his cloak, the faintest trace of a thoughtful smile appeared before disappearing just as quietly, while below, either Evelyn nor anyone else realized that someone inside the palace had recognized something about Damien that the rest of the kingdom had completely failed to see. By late afternoon the crowds had finally dispersed, yet the echoes of the morning refused to leave Havencrest. Shopkeepers paused their conversations whenever members of the royal guard passed by. Stable hands whispered while brushing horses. Bakers leaned across flower-covered counters to exchange rumors they had already heard 3 different ways. The princess had chosen the unknown man from the end of the line. Every version of the story became a little more dramatic as it traveled through the city, but one detail never changed. No one understood why. Inside the royal carriage, the atmosphere was remarkably different from the noise outside. Princess Evelyn sat beside the wide window, quietly watching the golden fields roll past as the palace rose in the distance. Across from her sat Damien, his posture straight but relaxed, his hands resting calmly in his lap. Neither of them had spoken since leaving the royal exchange. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It simply felt unnecessary to rush words that had not yet found the right moment. The carriage wheels rolled steadily across the stone road before reaching the smooth white bridge leading toward Ashford Palace. 2 lines of royal guards stood waiting beneath towering banners that fluttered gently against the afternoon sky. As the carriage approached the front gate, the captain of the guard stepped forward and offered a formal salute toward the princess before briefly turning his attention toward Damien. His expression revealed polite curiosity rather than suspicion. Damien acknowledged the greeting with a respectful nod, one so natural and composed that the captain instinctively returned it before realizing what he had done. He blinked once, slightly puzzled by his own reaction. Something about the stranger quietly invited respect without ever asking for it. The palace gates opened slowly, revealing gardens carefully arranged around sparkling fountains and rows of ancient oak trees planted by rulers centuries earlier. Servants lined the entrance to welcome the princess home, each lowering their heads in perfect unison. Damien observed everything without obvious surprise. He did not stare at the palace with awe as many first-time visitors often did. Instead, his eyes wandered toward the gardeners trimming rose bushes near the eastern courtyard. One elderly gardener struggled to lift a heavy watering can onto a stone ledge. Without hesitation, Damien stepped away from the carriage before any servant could react. He carried the can the remaining few feet with quiet ease before placing it gently beside the flower bed. "Thank you," the gardener said with a grateful smile. Damien simply answered, "The roses have been cared for with great patience. They deserve the same kindness in return." The old gardener looked pleasantly surprised. "You know roses?" Damien glanced toward the blossoms, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Someone once taught me that healthy roots matter more than beautiful petals." The words lingered in Evelyn's thoughts. They sounded less like casual conversation and more like a lesson passed from one generation to another. Before she could ask where he had learned such wisdom, the palace steward approached with several attendants. "Your Highness," he announced respectfully, "the guest quarters have been prepared." He turned politely toward Damien. If you will follow us, everything necessary for your comfort has been arranged. Damien inclined his head. You have my gratitude. Again the steward seemed momentarily caught off guard by the quiet dignity in the man's voice. As Damien followed the attendants through the palace corridor, he slowed beside a large painting hanging beneath an arched ceiling. It portrayed the kingdom's founding treaty signed nearly 2 centuries earlier. He studied the artwork for only a heartbeat before gently straightening the slightly crooked frame with careful fingertips. One of the palace historians standing nearby stared in astonishment. Almost no visitors ever noticed that tiny detail. Evelyn noticed the historian's reaction immediately. Is something wrong? She asked. The elderly scholar hesitated before answering. No, Your Highness. It is simply that painting has hung there for 20 years. Very few people know it was originally meant to sit perfectly level because it symbolizes balance between justice and mercy. He looked thoughtfully toward Damien disappearing around the corridor. Most people walk past it without ever seeing it. Evelyn quietly followed the same direction with her eyes, and for the first time a new question settled gently into her heart. If Damien truly had no past worth recording, then how did he keep recognizing things that only someone raised among knowledge, discipline, and quiet purpose should have understood? Evening settled gently over Ashford Palace, wrapping the white towers in shades of amber and deep blue as hundreds of lanterns flickered to life along the stone walkways. From her private balcony, Princess Evelyn watched the gardens below where fountains reflected the first stars appearing above the kingdom. The palace had always felt peaceful at twilight, yet tonight an unfamiliar feeling lingered beneath the beauty. Questions had followed her home from the marketplace, and none of them had easy answers. She finally turned from the balcony and made her way through the quiet corridors toward the west wing where the royal library remained open long after sunset. If the official records contained anything about Damien, she intended to find it herself. The library smelled of polished oak, aging parchment, and candle wax. Endless shelves stretched toward the vaulted ceiling while ladders rested against towering bookcases filled with generations of history. At the center of the room, the elderly royal archivist, Mr. Theodore Whitmore, looked up from his desk as Evelyn entered. He immediately stood and bowed respectfully. Your Highness, how may I assist you this evening? Evelyn smiled warmly. I would like to review the registration records from the northern transport convoys that arrived 6 weeks ago. Theodore's weathered eyebrows lifted slightly, but he nodded without hesitation. Moments later he carefully placed several leather-bound ledgers across the reading table. Evelyn thanked him before opening the first volume. Names, birthplaces, occupations, villages, families. Every page appeared meticulously organized. When she finally reached the final entries, she found Damien exactly where the auction master had described him. Number 47. First name only. No surname. Unknown origin. No documented relatives. No profession. The remaining spaces had simply been left blank. It looked less like a completed record and more like a page someone had intentionally abandoned. Evelyn frowned thoughtfully. Has this ever happened before? She asked quietly. Theodore adjusted his spectacles before studying the page himself. Not often, he admitted. Every traveler leaves traces somewhere. A tax record. A church register. A property claim. Even those with difficult lives usually leave behind a few pieces of history. He gently tapped the empty spaces beside Damien's name. This feels different. Evelyn slowly closed the ledger. Different how? The old archivist remained silent for a moment. It feels as though someone wished to erase a life rather than simply failing to record one. The observation settled heavily inside the quiet room. Before Evelyn could ask another question, soft footsteps echoed from the hallway. A young palace servant entered carrying a silver tray with tea prepared for the evening staff. As she reached Theodore's desk, one porcelain cup slipped dangerously close to the edge. Before anyone could react, a steady hand gently caught it without spilling a single drop. Damien stood beside the doorway holding the cup with calm precision. I believe this belongs here, he said politely before placing it back onto the tray. The young servant let out a relieved breath. "Thank you, sir." Damien smiled. "Anyone can lose their balance after a long day." Theodore stared at him with quiet surprise. "How did you know the library was still open?" Damien glanced toward the rows of windows where warm candlelight reflected against the glass. "Libraries that value learning rarely close before the readers finish asking questions." The archivist chuckled softly. "That sounds like something one of my professors used to say many years ago." Damien simply inclined his head without explaining further. Evelyn watched the exchange carefully. His words carried the ease of someone who belonged among scholars, not someone whose official record claimed no education at all. As Damien turned to leave, something small slipped unnoticed from the inside pocket of his worn coat onto the polished marble floor. He disappeared into the corridor before realizing it. Evelyn quietly walked over and bent down to retrieve the object. It was an old bronze signet ring, worn smooth by time but still bearing the faint engraving of a soaring hawk surrounded by 12 tiny stars. Theodore's face lost all color the instant he saw it. His eyes widened with unmistakable recognition as he whispered almost to himself, "That seal! It disappeared more than 20 years ago." The bronze ring rested quietly in Princess Evelyn's palm, yet it seemed to carry the weight of an entire forgotten generation. The tiny hawk engraved at its center had been worn smooth by countless years, but the circle of 12 stars surrounding it remained unmistakable beneath the candlelight. Theodore Whitmore continued staring at it as though he had seen a ghost step out of history itself. His hands trembled ever so slightly before he carefully reached toward a nearby cabinet and unlocked a narrow wooden drawer hidden beneath stacks of ancient maps. From inside he removed a faded volume wrapped in blue linen, its pages fragile with age. He turned them slowly until he reached an illustration nearly identical to the ring resting in Evelyn's hand. The same soaring hawk. The same 12 stars. The same remarkable craftsmanship. Evelyn looked from the book to the ring and back again. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. Theodore drew a slow breath before answering. "Long before your father became king, there existed another royal alliance beyond our borders. The House of Blackwood." Evelyn had heard the name only once as a child, mentioned briefly during an old history lesson before the subject unexpectedly changed. "I thought that family disappeared." Theodore nodded thoughtfully. "That is what history says. More accurately, that is what history was instructed to say." The old archivist gently traced the faded drawing with one finger. 24 years ago, the Blackwood household vanished after a diplomatic journey ended without explanation. Their lands were absorbed. Their records quietly removed from official archives. Only a handful of historians even remember they existed. Evelyn looked once more at the ring. Then how could Damien possess this? Before Theodore could answer, another voice quietly entered the conversation from the library doorway. "Because some stories survive even after their pages are burned." Evelyn turned immediately. Damien stood just inside the entrance, his calm expression unchanged, though his eyes rested briefly upon the ring in her hand. He did not appear surprised to see it. Instead, he offered a small, almost apologetic smile. "I wondered where I had misplaced it." Theodore remained speechless. Damien slowly approached the reading table, stopping only a few feet away. "You deserve an explanation," he said, looking directly at Evelyn. "At least part of one." His voice carried the same quiet steadiness it always had, but now every word seemed measured with greater care. "I was not captured by chance." Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, though she kept her expression composed. Damien continued. "For nearly 2 years I have traveled without revealing my name. I wished to see this kingdom through ordinary eyes instead of royal invitations. I visited villages, farms, markets, and roads where no banners announced my arrival. I wanted to understand the people rather than their ceremonies." Theodore stared in disbelief. "You allowed yourself to enter the transport convoys willingly?" Damien inclined his head once. "There are truths that cannot be discovered from a throne." Evelyn searched his face, suddenly remembering every quiet act she had witnessed since the marketplace. The patience. The humility. The way he noticed people everyone else ignored. None of it had been accidental. "Then you are not," she began. Damien gently finished the sentence for her. "No. I was never the man the ledger described." He looked toward the ancient illustration lying open upon the table before lifting his eyes once more. "My full name is Damien Blackwood." The library fell silent. Even the candle flames seemed perfectly still. Theodore slowly lowered himself into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the realization settling before him. The forgotten house had not vanished after all. It had simply learned to live without announcing itself. Damien looked back toward Evelyn, gratitude softening his expression. "When everyone else saw titles stripped away, you looked for character instead. That is why your decision mattered far more than you realize." Evelyn felt the weight of the bronze ring resting against her fingertips once again. She finally understood why every instinct had urged her toward the quiet stranger standing at the end of the line. She had not rescued a forgotten man. She had recognized one who had never forgotten who he truly was. For a long moment, no one inside the Royal Library spoke. The silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt reverent, as though the room itself understood that history had quietly returned through a door everyone believed had been closed forever. Princess Evelyn looked at Damien Blackwood with entirely new eyes, yet what surprised her most was not his forgotten family name. It was how little he had changed after revealing it. He still stood with the same calm posture, the same gentle expression, the same quiet humility she had first noticed in the marketplace. Nothing about his character had transformed. Only the world's understanding of him had. Theodore Whitmore slowly rose from his chair, placing one trembling hand over his heart before offering a respectful bow that belonged not to a servant greeting a guest, but to a historian acknowledging living history. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I spent decades believing your family had become nothing more than fading ink upon forgotten pages." Damien stepped forward before Theodore could lower himself any further and gently rested a hand upon the elderly man's shoulder. "Please do not apologize for believing what you were taught," he replied. "Truth has a way of waiting patiently until people are ready to recognize it." Those simple words settled warmly inside the quiet room. Evelyn smiled almost without realizing it. Throughout the day she had watched Damien thank strangers, comfort children, encourage frightened people, and quietly notice beauty others ignored. Now she understood that kindness had never been something he practiced. It was simply who he was. A soft knock interrupted the peaceful moment. The library doors opened, and King Edward Ashford entered accompanied only by the captain of the Royal Guard. His silver-trimmed cloak rested neatly across his shoulders, yet his expression revealed thoughtful curiosity rather than authority. His gaze moved from Evelyn to Damien before settling briefly upon the bronze signet ring resting on the table. Theodore instinctively bowed. Evelyn followed respectfully. Damien inclined his head with quiet dignity. The king looked at each of them before asking only one question. "Is everything I have heard true?" Evelyn stepped forward first. "Yes, father." King Edward remained silent for several moments. Then, to everyone's surprise, he walked directly toward Damien. Instead of questioning him, he extended his hand. Damien accepted it without hesitation. The king smiled faintly. "My daughter has always possessed an unusual habit," he said. "She notices what others overlook. I spent years wondering whether that quality would one day become a weakness." His eyes turned toward Evelyn with unmistakable pride. "Today she proved it may become this kingdom's greatest strength." Damien answered with quiet sincerity. "A ruler who sees only titles governs positions. A ruler who sees people changes lives." The king slowly nodded. "Then perhaps we both learned something today." Outside, the palace bells began ringing the evening hour. Their clear notes drifted across Havencrest, floating above gardens, rooftops, and busy streets where citizens still debated the princess's unexpected decision. None of them yet knew the full story. None of them realized that the man they dismissed as forgotten had chosen to walk among ordinary people simply to understand them. None of them knew that the future of two great houses had quietly crossed paths in a crowded marketplace because one young woman refused to measure a human life by a ledger. As Evelyn and Damien stepped onto the palace balcony together, the cool evening breeze carried the scent of blooming roses through the air. Lanterns shimmered across the city below like scattered stars, and somewhere in the distance a little girl smiled as she held a small wooden bird close to her heart. Evelyn looked toward the peaceful streets before quietly turning to Damien. "I thought I was choosing one man," she said with a gentle smile. Damien looked across the kingdom stretching beneath the night sky before answering in the same calm voice that had first caught her attention. "Sometimes the kindest choice does not rescue a single person. Sometimes it reminds an entire kingdom how to see." And far below, beyond the palace walls, tomorrow waited for everyone who still believed that true worth could only be measured by power, because by sunrise they would begin discovering that the greatest stories often begin with the person everyone else overlooked.